keep going to verse 30. Because thirdly, when David was at the lowest moment of his life, he bows and offers up a psalm of praise to God. And this is really what we'll find, especially tonight, was the essence of his life. He didn't get drowned in his depression and sorrow because he praised God, even at the darkest times. Verse 30. So David went up by the ascent of the Mount of Olives and wept as he went up, had his head covered and went barefoot, and we've seen that repeatedly. And all the people who were with him were wailing and weeping as they went up with their heads covered. But look at verse 32. Now it happened when David came to the top of the mountain, he worshipped God. That's where he worshipped God. He came to the spot where he was physically as high as possible to be. And at that moment of his sorrow and his weeping and his barefootedness, he just worships God. And something happens in that moment. Something happens in that exchange that carries him through the Shimei deal that we read when we stood a little while ago. God's servants can continue to worship even when life is tough and difficult and almost looking like it's impossible. That record of worship that flowed from David can flow from us. David worshipped God. What did he worship about God? The third psalm is divided into 3 parts. We're going to see it tonight. Each one is ending with that Selah, Selah, Selah. And first he reiterated the terrible place he was, that everybody is saying there's no help from God. And then he says, God, you've always helped me and always heard me and I trust you. And so the last section said, so I can lay myself down and sleep. David didn't deny his problems. He remembered God's faithfulness. And he trusted God. And that's what comes out of him. In the third psalm, David trusted God's control even through bitter tears of sorrow and grief. He relied on it, prayed for it, and instead of fear, he had faith and gave worship. Something changes right here in verse 32. And David isn't the same. He can't even look up. He has his head covered. His tears are rolling. He's walking like this, trudging along till he gets to the top of the mountain. He must have just been processing all this. And then he worships God, praises God, lifts his heart to God. And he can go through the whole Shimei thing. Well, look at verse 31 that I skipped over because the fourth truth we learn, the first truth is when David was at the bottom, God sent him help. Second truth is when he's at his weakest point, he waited. He didn't take matters in his own hands. Third one is when he's at the lowest moment, he bows and offers up a psalm of praise. But fourthly, in verse 31, when David was in the least control of his circumstances, he entrusted his situation to the Lord. He's least in control at this moment. And look what happens in verse 31. Then someone told David saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. That was the worst thing that could happen because Ahithophel was the man that was so wise that whatever he said was just like hearing from God. I mean, he was the chief counselor, and for good reason. David knew that he had helped him immensely. Now look what David does. And David said, verse 31, O Lord, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. What did David do when he was in least control of his circumstances? He turned his situation over to the Lord. He said, I can't do it. I can't. I've run out of town. Ahithophel is back there with all the armies of Israel and my renegade rebel son. I can't do anything except give it to you. You know what you'll find out? Anything you give to the Lord, He does a much better job. You remember the story of Sir Walter Raleigh and Queen Elizabeth and how Raleigh was asked to go on a voyage and he says, I don't know how I can do this. And the Queen says, while you're away, I'll watch over your business. And when Sir Walter Raleigh came back from his voyage to the New World, he found all of his businesses were so magnified. He had the greatest business because the Queen had done all of her shopping through all of his different companies, and he was a wealthy man. That's a material sense of the spiritual reality that David realized. When he didn't know what to do and he couldn't do anything about it, instead of muddling through and making a mess, he just said, You're going to have to take this, Lord. And he says, Lord, the end of verse 31, I pray you take the counsel of Ahithophel and make it foolish. People can often share reports that either lead us to fear or prompt us to prayer. And David, it prompted him to pray. And he lifted his heart in prayer to the Lord at this evil report. That was the worst thing that they could have said militarily, that Ahithophel was on the opposition. And David knew it, and he didn't let that get him. He just lifted it up to the Lord. And the very next verse is, he worships God. That was a whole part of the process. So fourthly, when David was least in control of his circumstances, he entrusts his situation to the Lord.